Part 3. Early Republic. Now let's go to the early Republican period. The Ottoman Dejurme bureaucrats continued flawlessly and uninterruptedly with the Republic. The Ottoman tradition of educating smart peasant children and sending successful ones to Europe continued. And these children were meant to be cultural Westerners, to be detached from their Anatolian Turkmen families and environment. Idris Küçükömür. There is a kind of Ottoman feudalism different from that of the West. Important element in the said Ottoman feudalism was the fief-holding sipahis, or the rulers. In short, Ottoman bureaucrats. If a remnant of these is to be sought, it is today's Republican bureaucrats who have serious commonalities with this remnant. The monthly dancing balls held in the 1950s at the mess halls of Turkish air bases and the American cultural islands in rural Turkey confer Zafer Toprak's observations on Turkish modernism. Touring Turkish Air Force Jazz Band was a successful instrument in preparing the forerunners of the Western lifestyle in the new Republic. Idris Küçükömür again. Tanzimat. This is also the era of balls. As domestic production was swiftly eroding and unemployment skyrocketing, balls held in the Ottoman embassies, palaces, and European embassies in Istanbul were in full swing. Ottoman bureaucrats partied together with their Western and Levantine friends. Then come Republican People's Party rule. As Anatolian towns were suffering from shortage of supplies, it was impossible not to notice continuation of the fancy balls in the new Republic, as against people's hating eyes. An important point. There was a cultural schism between the Dejurme bureaucrat of Arab, Persian, Byzantine synthesis and its counter, the peasant Turkmen in Ottoman times. Now, in the modernist Republic, the peasant Turkmen had to face the new westernized bureaucrat. Here too, the term Turkmen does not mean a race or ethnicity, but the ruled, the periphery. Küçükömür. The Congress held in Paris in 1902 by the bureaucratic Young Turk movement against Sultan Abdul Hamid is extremely important. This meeting revealed the core of the dichotomy that has become more evident in Ottoman society, or rather the tendency of schism between Westernist bureaucrats and Islamist Oriental Popular Front against them. The struggle shaping the vicious cycle at the top, a schism continuing to our day, and not finding reflection at the grassroots. Indeed, the Young Turks and the other Republican bureaucrats did realize the need to go to the people and to bring civilization to the countryside. Mission civilisatrice. They had to have a common vocabulary with the people. Thus came the simplification of the Ottoman language. Yet the efforts were fruitless. How could they accept a Turkmen revolution toppling their millennial rule? A Turkmen coup that would topple their own class in a somewhat Marxist understanding. To bring about a genuine democratic Anatolian revolution, Idris Küçükömür believed that their only goal was cultural modernization. In any case, neither the population nor the infrastructure was prepared for such revolution, nor was any party yet aware of it. Class consciousness. Beginnings of conflict. Strange enough, it was not the CHP, the champion of Western cultural ideology and comprador of Western lifestyle, which made Turks materialist. Grassroots modernization had to wait for the second half of the 20th century. With Republic's two pious presidents, Turgut Özal and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who woke Turkish appetite for material possessions of this world and made Turks materialist. As industrialization pulled masses into the metropoles and 93% of the population became urban, they woke up from the millennial sleep for the afterlife and had started to attack the material goods of this world with greed and hunger. Call it Ataturk's Weberian dream. Democracy and modern cultural development would follow. A paradox needs attention here. It is the 21st century industrialization, infrastructure investments, and modernization of the AKP, which continued on the path laid by Özal, that made the people virtually materialistic. But since materialism is a young Turk ideology, especially of Abdul Hamid's students, the votes of materialists go to the CHP, not the AK party. Why? Because as the continuation of the Young Turk, CHP promises a cosmopolitan Western lifestyle, including LGBTQ. In other words, CHP proposes not only the materialist philosophy, but also the alienation of the self from its roots in the Deschamais tradition, aiming for a cultural transformation by completely erasing the past, including authentic tradition, morality, and religious understanding. And roughly 1/4 of the population, descendants of the millennially oppressed periphery, enthusiastically embrace this offer. One of the most crucial research areas facing our nation is reset, or rejection of the past. Translation of foreign laws, as well as changing bankrupt institutions and concepts, were subjects that the state apparatus discussed in the early days of the Republic. But why do young people today want to run away from who they are? Why do they want to put their past behind? Furthermore, why don't they even want to confront their past? 1/4 of the population is in self-hatred. To overcome such self-hatred, the first phase should be falling into an identity crisis. Not on the horizon yet. Then would come the search for a modern authentic identity. Again, not yet. Then how to build a new identity? Where is politics in all of this confusion? Although AKP is the modernizing party, it wants to preserve the historical values of Anatolia as much as possible, and to use them as shock absorbers against sudden global shocks to balance the materialist culture that it had created. Another fact that requires academic scrutiny. Going back to history, Selali revolts, the rebellion of the periphery against the ruling Ottoman Deschamais class. Though a technical manifestation of Turkmen's resentment born out of economic hardships and oppression, it was defined as a religious war, just like today's rivalry is being distorted as the war of religious fanatics against secular modernists, to be crushed as a religious uprising, just like the Selali revolts before. Küçükhamur again. The Westernist secular bureaucrat tries to save the state with Westernization, and Westernization needs economic forces, which Turkey of the time did not have. Hence the opposition with the Great Popular Front, leading to a struggle between secular Westerners and religious Easterners. A game in which the civilian and military bureaucrat would supposedly be considered progressive, while the Islamist Oriental camp, which was tricked into isolation by bureaucrats in imperialist grip, would be considered reactionary, regressive. In the second constitutional monarchy, we saw the continuation of the rivalry between the people who took refuge in the Islamist circles versus the secular bureaucrats. We see the same fight in the Republican era. Unfortunately, the fight has been seen as a superstructural fight between religious people and the secularists who were called progressive just because they were Westernists. Thus, Turkey, which was conditioned not to go down to the fundamentals of the contradictions, was divided into two. Only imperialism benefited from the schism. Doesn't it look like that today? We should add a large part of the military officers to the Westernist secular bureaucrat group. But these officers, so-called intellectuals, could not understand the effects of imperialism on the economy, especially the choking of industry and resulting unemployment. This is why they were unable to establish a real organic connection with the people for their movement, which they called revolution or reform. There seems to be a so-called cultural revolution. Of the existing productive forces and the people, the majority will not be able to accept the elite cultural revolution movement, and will even react. We should not be misled by the religious appearance of the reaction. What we must do is to understand the historical truth behind it. We must correctly see the Westernist laicist bureaucrat's exploitation of such religious appearance for his power. Back to Erol Göka. Selali revolts and the despotic measures to extinguish them have never ceased. Actually, as against assertions, their uprisings were not motivated by any form of sectarianism. A report prepared during final years of Magnificent Suleiman's time regarded as the height of the Ottoman Empire, noted that desperate Anatolian Turkmens were eating grass due to starvation. The February 28, 1997 junta generals tagging provincial merchants as green Islamist capital and banning trade with them, while encouraging globalist, cosmopolitan Istanbul capital against the rising rural capital, is a grave continuation of this historical Machiavellian game. Moreover, Western interests, using the expertise of Orientalist academics and experts, are observing Turkish society like a lab bug under a microscope. In the lab, they find two instruments for manipulation: the religious laicist fight and love-enmity of Ataturk, and they skillfully use these two factors in the historical class warfare of the two classes. The Republican class war seems to have started between the CHP and the DP. This, too, is a misleading image. In reality, the DP is an offshoot of the CHP. Both were established by Deşirme cadres. In the 1940s and 1950s, the infrastructure had not been built, and the political lines had not yet been sharpened. At the beginning of the Republic, the ratio of 90% peasant versus 10% urban has reversed to 93% urban versus 7% peasant today. And the masses that have flooded the metropolises have now begun to notice the diversity of interest in the historical ruling class with much clearer lines. The Free Party, which Ataturk had asked his friend Fethi Okyar to found in 1930, was an experiment that scared the Deşirme bureaucrats of the serious potential of provincial threat to their historical rule. The 1950 elections were the last warning to the Deşirme bureaucracy. The reactionary political Islam rhetoric, classically used by the USA to prevent democratization in Islamic countries today, was used in Turkey against the awakening of the Anatolian Turkmen and formed the so-called pro-Ataturk basis of military coups manipulated by the USA. Academics like Taner Timur, in line with Deşirme tradition, describe the current Anatolian Turkmen uprising against Westernist cosmopolitan governments as a religious reactionary counter-revolution to the cultural revolution of the Republic. Whereas for Idris Küçükömür, a bureaucrat was attempting to impose Western institutions, Western culture, and Western lifestyle on the populace within the historical Ottoman tradition without offering the general public anything. Theirs were referred to as revolutions. In truth, the Western-oriented junta attempted to stop the Anatolian Turkmen from embracing the materialism that Ataturk had imagined was a regressive response. In reality, the West saw its values and lifestyle as the end of history and imposed them on the global village. Any nation out of their realm was a threat to Western interests. Those who don't share my values and my way of life are a threat to me. Hence, all nations had to be ruled by autocrats educated in the West or Westernized. If not, they were toppled. The West could not allow the Anatolian populace to overthrow their useful idiots, the men of the West. Parties of Islamic cultures were a perennial threat to the West. Western media were always ready to demonize parties and politicians of Islamic roots. To sum up, Europe and the United States prevented Muslim countries from democratizing. They also prevented democracy in these nations from developing in their own course and evolving naturally. After joining NATO, the Republican Deşirme administration adopted a very different stance from that of the romantic, aspiring cultural Westernism of the Tanzimat era. With industrialization and awakening masses flowing to the metropolises, the country was confronted with a modern class conflict this time. The Ottoman Empire did not have the capitalist, working classes of industrialization in the Marxist sense, nor the aristocrats versus serfs of feudal Europe. Yet, there were two classes in conflict: the ruling and ruled classes, as Plato had pointed out 2,500 years earlier. The periphery, which flowed from the rural to the metropolises with its religion and traditions, could no longer be assimilated into the Western cultural mix, nor could it be allowed to take over the power from the Western comprador administration. In the process, an artificial political separation was created. In the 1970s, peasant students were split into right-wing and left-wing groups and killed each other, while the bureaucratic elite and its Western supporters gained time. In the early republic, in its millennial learned helplessness, the peasant, 90% of the population, could not rebel against the Desherme. Forget daring to. They could not even think of preventing the execution of their beloved Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, leaving his neck to his executioner generals. Looking from a different angle, the execution of a prime minister was a continuation of the toppling and execution of Ottoman sultans and grand viziers by unhappy janissaries. According to the Ottoman social contract, the state had to give security and justice to the Reaya, and in return, the Reaya was never to be engaged in politics and governance. Hence, toppling governments and executions were political matters which never were people's business. And comes urbanization. When people became 93% urban, in materialist awakening, they started to go for their political interests, this time to get over their despair, and defy rolling tanks with bare hands. Bloodless Revolution of the Turk. As experiences of Europe's 1789, 1830, 1848, 1917, and China's 1949 Communist Revolution showed, by the late 20th century, the conflict of the historical ruling class versus emerging new bourgeois in Turkey was maturing for a bloody showdown. Necmettin Erbakan, leader of the then Islamists, however, prepared the ground for a bloodless revolution thanks to his patience and common sense. And it was with AKP that the democratic, non-violent Anatolian Revolution occurred. The army was ordered to its proper barracks. As the Ottoman provincial judges stood up for the locals against the corrupt bureaucracy, the Republican judiciary started to revert to its roots, making peace with the Anatolian values from which they emerged, and act by them. Police were the first in bureaucracy to embrace their roots, and rural Turks welcomed them warmly. The Republic started with a few universities, castles of westernization, in 3 big cities as elite colleges like the Ottoman Enderun, aiming to produce bureaucrats of the new state. With the expansion of 210 universities into rural Anatolia, unassimilated Anatolian academics started to emerge. Old academia of the Ottoman elite Enderun tradition protested the expansion of universities with the pretext that quality was sacrificed in the process. Many academics, feeling cut off from their old elite status, started to leave the country. In short, through a peaceful revolution, the Desherme bureaucracy and academia ceded its position to the Anatolian Turks. Founding father of Turkish democracy. Erdogan went down in history as the founding father of Turkish democracy with the July 15th revolution. July 15th is a millennial revolution, the day Turks stopped the Ottoman Janissary tradition of toppling and killing rulers. It is at least as important as the French Revolution. On that day, Turks, under the leadership of Erdogan, declared to the world that they would never, ever again leave their democratically elected politicians at the mercy of bloody juntas. It is a great national holiday. At this point, we can express without hesitation, with a sterile view, far above political considerations. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George said about Ataturk, "Centuries rarely produce geniuses. Look at our misfortune that the genius of the 20th century was given to the Turks, and fate brought him before us. Just as his word has echoed in history, a similar word will be uttered about Recep Tayyip Erdogan by future historians. Erdogan, who destroyed the 1,000-year-old Desherme order that has been ruling since the Seljuks, returned to the Turk the power to govern. Beyond emancipating headscarves and abolishing oppression of Muslims, Erdogan recognized the Kurdish identity, freed Kurdish speech in Turkey, recognized the rights of the Alevis, and returned their Alevi deeds despite Ataturk's order. Some sheiks' deeds, He has already made his mark in history as a revolutionary who also recognized and restored the rights of confiscated non-Muslim religious heritage too. Reactionary counter-revolution. The Turkish Revolution of the 15th of July has been a dark day for the West, which is in the habit of ruling Muslim countries with Westernist generals and autocrats. 15th of July was the day the West and its Westernist representatives tried a final regressive counter-revolution against the millennial popular revolution of the Turkmen. Just to remind you, junta members who have killed 250 innocent humans and bombed the National Congress, Presidential Palace, and the Ministry of Defense are protected in the USA, Germany, Greece, and other NATO countries. Fact. Counter-revolution was indeed both real and bloody. The urbanized people had left their learned helplessness behind. Their message was clear. After that night, any Dejrme junta which was planning a coup had to risk a bloody, massive public reaction. Erdogan's charisma created millions of brave people who would die for him should a junta attempt to kill him. Interestingly, CHP, the representative political party of the bankrupt Dejrme bureaucracy, wanted the wounded July 15th veterans to be prosecuted for opposing the junta coup. Fact. In other words, it was a warning that Anatolian Turks should not oppose the coups of the military, bureaucrat Dejrme class. After a while, the CHP began not to celebrate the July 15th democracy days, because July 15th was a real popular revolution that overthrew the historical, archaic class represented by the CHP. As we said earlier, CHP is the political and cultural successor of the Tanzimat and Union and Progress cadres. In short, the date of July 15th, 2016 can be commemorated as the birthday of Turkish democracy and people's power. It can be considered as the collapse of the millennial oligarchic, alien, Dejrme class. Let us repeat, July 15th, 2016 is the birthday of Turkish democracy. From now on, every putschist has to start by knowing that the coup will be bloody and that the people will protect the leader they chose democratically. To put it straight, starting with the tulip era of the 18th century, continuing with the Tanzimat and the early republic, it was clear that monkeying Western culture and alienation from roots was not a revolution. The accusation of religious reaction, bigotry, and counter-revolutionary stance ascribed to the Anatolian people turned out to be empty rhetoric. Revolution in the sense of class warfare is the overthrow of the 1,000-year-old Dejrme rule by the Anatolian Turkmen. The reactionary counter-revolution, on the other hand, is the effort of Westernist juntas to take back the power from Anatolian Turkmen. In this sense, a note, far above the daily politics, Tayyip Erdogan has taken his place in history as the founding father of the Turkmen government and democracy. In a sense, he realized Ataturk's dream. Turkmen to the mission. In the beginning, we said Turkmen was the core who founded the Seljuk and Ottoman empires. Then we said that the Turkmen were excluded from the administration. Let's be fair, it was the Ottoman Dejrme bureaucrats who founded the Republic, and were the only educated elite to do so. The anthem of Mulkiye, the Faculty of Political Sciences, which I am honored to have been a lecturer, is, O motherland, let your tears rest, because we have grown up. It dates back to 1918 wartime. Gallipoli defense of World War I is referred to as the War of High School Teenagers, and the Sakarya battle is referred to as the Officers' War. Yet the hope and self-confidence that came with the victory did not last long. With the early death of Ataturk, cautious, reactive, defensive reflexes resumed encapsulating Turkish politics and bureaucracy. World War II also had an effect in cautious politics, which postponed Anatolian takeover. The core Turkmen who founded the Ottomans and Seljuks came belatedly with the July 5th, 2016 revolution, not to hand over their power back to the Dejrme. What might have occurred if the Turkmen had not seized power? Deşarme bureaucrats indeed founded the young republic. Apart from Ataturk, they were the bureaucrats still in the defensive mood of Ottoman diplomacy. Against the West, they were still apologetic and passive. Some were proposing an American mandate during the Salvation War. Many among them still feared policies that would have annoyed the West. In such a defensive, apologetic spirit, Ottoman decomposition may have continued in the Republic. We see the same spirit in contemporary politics in the statements of some politicians in need of praise from Western countries. On the other hand, Anatolian Turkmen hailed in from the exclusion of centuries and were ready to take over the state with a brand new, dynamic spirit. It was indeed Ataturk who ignited the spirit. With his death, Anatolian Turkmen rule was delayed. In the early 21st century, Turkmen took over their state back again, this time to stay. Call of Duty after 6 centuries. Turkmen waking up to this world with new energy, put the new republic on the rise. Behind the Anatolian victory, to repeat, there is a serious factor that is hardly noticed. Ottoman rule was of a twin, the Sultan and his Deşarmes. Sultan was the brain and Deşarmes were the body. By abolishing the Ottoman dynasty, Ataturk destroyed the head of the Deşarmes and turned the Deşarmes into a rooster without a head. So as long as Ataturk and his successor İnönü ruled, bureaucrats did not feel the loss. With military coups, the last of which was intended on the 15th of July 2016, they tried to cling to their historical power, and without a head, lost in the end. Yes, the class war has been won, and transformation has been accomplished. Now it's time for the Great Jihad. What is Turkmen's Great Jihad? Starting from its own millennial civilization, it is to create a brand new Turkish synthesis, Turkish modernity. Such synthesis, starting with Anatolian values, has to include the Western and other civilizations of the global family. With its historical antecedent, the only appropriate choice for an expanding global civilization to be. To start with, useful parts of Western civilization must be adopted. Then its wrongs, such as its genocides and inability to survive in harmony with other civilizations, its efforts to impose its values and lifestyle to all nations of the world, to be discarded. Historically, Islam and its underbranch Turkish civilization indeed had the philosophy of live and let live with other civilizations. Within such spirit, it is so easy for them to adopt and engage good parts of the Western civilization together with those of the other civilizations of humanity to create an embracing new universal civilization for the new Turkish century. One may ask, why? History is the witness. We did it before. We are among the most eligible to do it again. West failed to create an embracing civilization. In fact, we shall indeed benefit from Jared Diamond, Ian Morris, Niall Ferguson, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, Samuel Huntington, Francis Fukuyama, etc., in taking lessons from the wrongs and goods of the Western civilization. We are talking about a peaceful worldview that will rival the declining European concept of the nation-state and capitalist philosophy. We should be able to make far superior assessments and synthesis attempts on questions of why we lag behind and how we can surpass others without being destructive. And I have unwavering faith the Turk can do it.